When Sylvia Earle was young, her parents taught her to respect nature and not to be afraid of the unknown. She carried these lessons with her as she learned to scuba dive, supported herself through a degree in botany by working in college labs, earned a master's degree at Duke University, and embarked on a 6-week National Science Foundation expedition in the Indian Ocean when her children were just toddlers. Sylvia Earle became Dr. Earle in 1966 when she received a PhD from Duke. 2 years later, she visited the Bahamas, not to sit on the beach as a tourist, but rather to visit 100 feet below the water's surface in a submersible deep diver. She was 4 months pregnant at the time. In 1979, Sylvia Earle walked untethered on the ocean floor at a lower depth than anyone before or since. In the 1980s, she co-founded 2 companies to develop robotic subsea systems, and in 1992, founded Deep Ocean Exploration and Research, now owned by her daughter. In the 1990s, Dr. Earle served as chief scientist of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. In 1995, she won the museum's own Washburn Award for outstanding contributions toward public understanding and appreciation of science. Dr. Earle is currently explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society and founder of Mission Blue Foundation. She was named Time Magazine's first hero for the planet and was called a living legend by the Library of Congress. She joins us tonight to talk about her book, The World is Blue: How Our Fate and the Oceans Are One, and about her work to protect the blue heart of the planet. Please welcome Dr. Sylvia Earle.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming in on this spring evening, taking a dive with me. This is a great dive to be in, this museum. I was resident in Boston back in the 60s, early 70s. It's a bit like coming home because I still have some deep roots here with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and have, of course, 5 years at Harvard as a research fellow. And I have so many friends in this part of the planet. So I really am pleased to have an opportunity to come back here. The Washburns are longtime friends, fellow explorers. So again, to come to this institution is a special treat. And to talk about the world is blue. I mean, it is. There it is. Any astronaut can tell you, the world is blue. I had a chance to speak at the World Bank 2 years ago. I showed this image and pointed out that that is the World Bank. That's where all the assets are. We have been drawing down the assets from the land and certainly from the sea throughout the history of our species. But we now understand what we didn't understand when I first began exploring the ocean a few years ago, that there are limits to what we can take out of the ocean and what we can put into the ocean without consequences back to us. We did not know that in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of people still seem to live under the illusion that we can get away with just about anything we want to in the ocean, out of sight, out of mind. The belief that fish are so resilient that we can just, our job is to figure out ways and means of catching them. We've only recently begun to realize that we also have to be careful about how we catch what's in the ocean, how many we catch, and so on. The same kinds of learning experiences that we finally came to with respect to creatures on the land. When I was a child, I remember hearing stories from one of my uncles about how when he was a market hunter, catching and bringing to market by the truckload ducks and geese from New Jersey marshes and little furry things from the marshes that went to market by the truckload. he couldn't do it as a middle-aged man because, well, there just weren't that many birds anymore. And there weren't that many little muskrats in the marshes. So he had to do something else. There wasn't anybody around to conveniently bail him and his fellow hunters out of hard times. So he became a stonemason, began building fireplaces and walls and houses out of stones. Today, we're facing a similar crisis, but it's on the land, not on the land. Well, we still have it on the land. We have come to the understanding that if you want to have any birds to take home for dinner once in a while, you have to protect the marshes. You have to not take them anywhere, anytime, in any numbers. And the flyways, you have to think about their migration routes. And now we know we have to do the same thing for fish. If we want to have fish, if we want to have fishermen, there have to be fish, duh. But it has been such a long time getting to this point. Meanwhile, from the time that I was a child to the present time, or even mostly in the last few decades, we've seen a collapse of many of the fish that we most like to eat. Cod were already in trouble by the 1950s, but since then, they've plunged even further, as have creatures such as tunas and swordfish and sharks and halibut and groupers and snappers and menhaden. And, well, there have been times when, herring and other small fish go up and down, and so do the fate and times of the fishermen who go after them. But there has been, however you look at it, a steady, inexorable decline from what they were a couple of hundred years ago to what they are today. That the decline of ocean wildlife is real, and there are consequences back to us. I've had the great joy of splashing around in the oceans of the world, starting in New Jersey when I was 3 years old, when a wave knocked me over and the ocean got my attention, and creatures in the sea have held my attention ever since. Those wonderful, glossy, thorny horseshoe crabs on the Jersey shore, I thought were so cool. Even as a little kid, today you have wind-up toys and things. Well, I had horseshoe crabs. I've had the great pleasure of living underwater. It was when I was living here in Boston that there was a headline in the Boston paper that said, what did it say? Boston housewife, Beacon Hill housewife, dives, or lives, Beacon Hill housewife heads team of aquanauts. That's what it was. I was a housewife. Of course, I was a scientist, and I was whatever. But it made a good headline. It wasn't in this underwater laboratory. I've actually had the great pleasure of spending time on 9 different occasions living underwater, staying to, sleep with the fishes and swim out of our underwater laboratories to get acquainted with not just the fish, but other creatures that are there. This is the Aquarius, one of the few remaining places that you can go and stay for extended periods underwater. It's the only one, actually, that's in business these days for scientific observations down in the Florida Keys. It's our nation's, basically our space station in the sea, where 6 people can stay for a week or 10 days and swim out of a hole in the floor into the ocean beyond, the biggest swimming pool on the planet. And in the process, get to really know the ocean in ways that transcend what you can do with in and out visits. I do love to dive, and have had the great fun of splashing around in the oceans of the world just using scuba. But to be able to stay long enough to really get acquainted with individual fish, get to see them day and night in the same place. On one occasion, I had a chance to go to the Florida Keys with Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers took off his sweater and he put on his skins. He took off his shoes and he put on his fins. And we went into the fish's neighborhood. We really did. And afterwards, the whole film crew, Mr. Rogers, went to dinner. Fred Rogers and I were among the last to arrive. Some had already started. And it was just a joy to watch him, Fred, go from table to table, kind of inspecting what people were dining on. And he said with all of the childlike sincerity in the world, it was his hallmark, I just can't understand how you can be eating fish tonight after what we did today. And he had noodles, linguine. But he could see, just as an in-and-out diver, that fish are individuals. He got to appreciate their faces. He was just marveling at that in our little splash around in the Florida Keys. But when I had a chance to stay for days and sometimes weeks at a time, it was one of the breakthroughs for me to see how individual every fish is, how they, not just how they look, but also how they behave. No two barracuda exactly alike, no two angelfish exactly alike, no two parrotfish exactly alike. It was a breakthrough for me just in terms of appreciating something about the nature of fish. Most people never have a chance. They see a lot of fish swimming with lemon slices and butter, but swimming in the ocean? Well, you have the aquarium here in this part of the world, and aquariums have really become halfway houses for fish and people and other creatures of the ocean and freshwaters as well in recent years. And I really applaud that phenomenon of having really thoughtful aquariums that get people to understand something about the blue part of the planet. I've also had the fun of using little submarines. The gym suit that was described in my introduction was a system that was really a suit. You got your arms and legs down metal sleeves, and it looked a bit like the Michelin Man or an astronaut. I said it was like a walking refrigerator. But it had certain constraints about it. For one thing, my arms were in metal sleeves, and what I could use to pick up things just like pinchers, and it was all muscle powered. This little submarine called Deep Worker, now there are more than a dozen of them operating here and there around the world. It too is a diving suit. Well, actually, it's like a little one-person sports car. And it's so simple to drive that even a scientist can do it. Ha! I'm living proof. We had a number of scientists, actually close to 100 of individuals, about half of them scientists, during the Sustainable Seas expeditions with the National Geographic and the Goldman Foundation, and NOAA, the agency that really looks after, has primary responsibility for looking after this nation's ocean and atmospheric issues. We used the first of these little submersibles during a 5-year program to look at the offshore areas in this country that have been designated for protection as marine sanctuaries. We went out to Stellwagen Bank, down the coast, Florida Keys, in the Gulf Coast, around the Flower Garden banks, and up the West Coast, and out to Hawaii. And even, we didn't take the submarines, but we took an expedition to Whangatali Bay out in American Samoa. So we tried over the 5-year period to take a look at the small but important areas that are counterparts to national parks in the sea. Although not nearly as well protected as national parks are, you can do just about anything inside the sanctuaries as you can outside, including taking fish home for dinner. Commercial fishing is allowed in the sanctuaries too, something that may have to change if we are to actually enjoy fishermen who need fish in order to survive. But actually the ocean needs fish to survive too. And therefore we do. Fish are as important to the sea as birds are to the land. Actually, perhaps even more important in terms of their abundance, their diversity, their role in what it takes to make the ocean systems prosper. So I had the fun of scooting around in these little subs, as did a number of others, to get to see the ocean down to as much as 2,000 feet, to be able to stay not overnight, although I did once off the coast of Mexico, went down at sunset, came up at dawn, using the little underwater, this little Deep Worker 1 atmosphere submarine, no decompression. How about that, you divers out there? Go to 2,000 feet and no decompression. Of course, it's not quite the same. You don't feel the chilly water creeping down the back of your neck, but you're nice and warm and dry inside, using manipulators that you control from inside a little more adroitly than the arms and legs of the gym suit. Most of us probably just don't think about how connected we are to the sea. Actually, I've come to think of all of us as sea creatures, because whether you spend most of your time above water or some of your time below, or if you're a fish or a whale, quite a lot of time underwater, most of the time, we're all, every creature on the planet, totally and utterly dependent on the ocean for our existence. Take away the ocean, and what have you got? A planet a whole lot like Mars. There may be a bit of life on Mars, but not a hospitable place for the likes of us, or most of the rest of life on Earth. Of course, it starts with water. 97% of Earth's water is ocean. And what remains wouldn't be there either, but for the ocean. That water evaporates from the sea, up into clouds, falls back on land and sea. The ocean really drives the way the world works, shapes climate and weather, regulates temperature, home for most of life on Earth. Our life is not just dependent on the existence of the ocean as a big body of rocks and water. It's life in the ocean that makes this planet work. Life on Earth, on the land as well as the sea, generating oxygen. The estimate is about 70% of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from the sea, from creatures in the sea. Little green and blue-green creatures. Many of them we just didn't know about when I was a kid. So much we didn't understand about the ocean. We didn't know about the mountain chains that run down the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. We didn't know about hydrothermal vents, seafloor spreading, continental drift. We certainly didn't know about Prochlorococcus. Prochlorococcus, that little blue-green bacterium that Penny Chisholm, an MIT scientist, discovered with her colleagues on an oceanographic expedition using some new technologies that were able for the first time to detect the existence of this little tiny creature that now is known to be so abundant that it is thought to account for 1 in every 5 breaths you take. 20% of the oxygen generated by this blue-green beast that is out there churning away, part of our life support system. I worry about changing the chemistry of the planet in ways that could affect the life and times of these small creatures. And what else is out there? What else is down there? Consider that we've only seen maybe 5% of the ocean below the surface. Consider how few the submersibles are that can take us into the depths. Even the remotely operated systems that now outnumber the ones that can take us into the depths as observers didn't exist. Again, when I was a child, the first ones started appearing in the 70s and 80s. Now there are really, literally thousands of remotely operated systems, camera systems with tool packages, some of them being deployed in the Gulf of Mexico right now to try to solve the problem of how do you stop a gushing oil well 5,000 feet underwater. There aren't that many remotely operated vehicles that can operate in 5,000 feet of water. And you start ticking off the number of manned submersibles that can do it. This one can't. It goes to 500 meters, about 1,500 feet, and that's it. I mean, you can go deeper, but we're talking about round trips here. 50 years ago, there was a system that could go to full ocean depth, the Trieste. 2 people went for about half an hour, and that's it. Don Walsh, one of the 2 people, the other was Jacques Picard. Don Walsh said, you know, we thought it was really great to be the first ones to go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, 7 miles down. We never thought that we would be the last. So far, they're the first and the only ones to do this. How absurd is that? 9 years after they went to the deepest part of the ocean, the first footprints were put on the moon. The Ra expeditions that Heyerdahl initiated started in 1969, 1970. We have sent probes to Mars, sent probes beyond our own solar system, but we still haven't gotten back to the deepest part of the ocean with people on board Actually, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution this year launched a robotic device, an autonomous underwater system, no people on board, people sitting up on the surface, looking at the results of having a system that was as much as 7 miles down. They actually made 9 dives into the Mariana Trench during the past year. Japan previously had a remotely operated system that operated at that depth, but they lost it at sea a couple of years after it first started operating. So there is really presently only one system that can attain full ocean depth. I flew here 7 miles high in the sky. I was eating lunch and looking at movies, for heaven's sakes, taking a nap. But to go 7 miles underwater, it's still a big deal. It's still one of those goals that we need to embrace. How do we explore this part of the solar system, this part of the universe? We have the technology. We have materials that can operate now much more successfully at full ocean depth than did exist in 1960 or in 70 or 80 or 90. The technologies get better and better. Glass is a promising material for a pressure hull to go to full ocean depth. This is not glass, this is acrylic. Acrylic has been used with the Johnson Sea-Link submersibles and with others that have taken us into depths down to 2,000-3,000 feet, 1,000 meters or so. But I had the fun of using this particular one called the Deep Sea, S-E-E. Get the joke? In Costa Rica, offshore from Costa Rica, about halfway to the Galapagos Islands, Cocos Islands, beautiful, beautiful group of islands that are the tips of undersea mountains that really, when you go to the top, you see a lot of wonderful terrestrial creatures, but underwater, that's where the action really begins. And for several weeks, with the National Geographic expedition last September, several of us had the great joy of stepping into this little bubble and cruising around. It's something that all of you should want to do so much that you'll make it happen, one way or the other. You might have to do what I had to do, which is to start a company to build submarines, but I hope not. I hope that the day comes when you can have Hertz Rent-A-Sub, or Avis, or whatever your agency of choice might be, so that you can go out and look at these creatures coming by warm and dry and have plenty of time, no decompression. I don't mind the decompression penalty that you have to pay, but you are limited to how deep you can go. Scuba divers normally go maybe 50 meters on a good day. 150 feet is considered a deep dive. Some people go deeper. I've been deeper on air, but you don't stay very long, and you do have to decompress as a cost of that momentary access. But to have atmospheric systems, you can push the edge, go and stay for longer periods of time, and do more meaningful, thoughtful pieces of work, and get to see the critters down there on their own terms, and not have to bounce back to the surface after a brief encounter. When I began diving, 1953 is when I first had scuba tanks on my back. I tried a copper diving helmet the year before off the coast of, in Florida. Actually, it was in a river, the Weeki Wachee River. I had a chance to be the kid sister who followed her brother and some of his buddies to try out a system of the sort that William Beebe first used back in the 1930s. And sponge divers and salvage divers have used since the middle of the 1800s. Sharks were considered to be the bad guys. The only good shark was a dead shark. Watch out, there are man-eaters out there. So I was concerned at first, and then I realized, man-eaters? I don't have to worry. We do have to worry now, though, about man-eating sharks. We are eating so many sharks. We've actually taken on the order of 90% of the sharks out of the sea since I first began diving. We have that power, that technology, the capacity, and the hunger, or at least not hunger really, more of a luxury appetite for things like shark fin soup and mako shark steak or whatever, the macho meal, eat shark, be a shark, whatever. In some places, they still abound, and Cocos is one such place. Even the diversity, this is mostly one species, little white-tip sharks that hunt at night. And you can go down and be right in the midst of them while they're out gobbling up fish, and they pay zero attention to you. They've got their sights on fish. Fortunately, we don't qualify in that respect. It's not just sharks now in trouble, the decline of so much of the ocean wildlife. It is what provokes me, drives me now to spend much more time talking about the problems that we now face with the ocean than I do actually splashing around in the ocean, which is, of course, where I love most to be. I don't resist all that much, actually. I get to go get wet somewhere about once a month, but I would probably be there longer and more often if I didn't feel compelled to come and tell you about it, tell anybody I can catch, talk to the kids, write books, race around to attend meetings. I'll be addressing a committee next week to talk about the oil spill rather than jumping around in the water itself, talking about the problems. We have a problem with fish. We're just taking too many. And it's disaster time, or it's opportunity time. We have one of the best chances we'll ever have going forward. Right now, it's going to get worse unless we take some action to reduce our appetite for wildlife from the sea. There was a time when we humans fed ourselves with wildlife from the land. I mean, they called us Neanderthals. And even after that, in the early part of this country, when you think of the Lewis and Clark expedition 200 years ago, part of the incentive, big part of the incentive, was to go bring back furs, valuable skins from wildlife. Well, we don't do so much of that these days. People still hunt, but we have learned that we've got to protect the places that give rise to wildlife if we want to take a few home for dinner once in a while. We haven't quite gotten that through our thick heads yet about the ocean. Even though we kind of recognize it, we haven't had the courage that it takes to abstain from consuming wildlife at the level that we now expect and take for granted is normal. Images like this should be common. They're not. It's uncommon to see sharks these days. I always rejoice when I see a shark. I think something's right with the ocean if you see a shark. It's not the theme that you used to hear, the only good shark is a dead shark. Sharks are really necessary alive. The only good shark is a live shark, really. Ask any grouper. I mean, sharks sometimes eat grouper, but grouper are part of the food chain too. In fact, there are postcards that you can see if you go to the Bahamas with big Nassau grouper with a little balloon coming out of their mouth, and the words say something like, eat beef, or eat chicken, or eat broccoli. But it just somehow to give us a little nudge to think about maybe we ought to cut back on ocean wildlife as part of our diet in order to give wildlife in the sea a chance to prosper. This is the time. We need to at least establish big areas in the ocean where the fish and other ocean wildlife, even the lobsters, clams, oysters, need sanctity, a sanctuary, where they can do what it takes to make more of them. The faces that you come to understand when you dive in the ocean or go to the aquarium. I take people sometimes off the streets to go into the New England Aquarium to look at the fish and to verify, people verify for themselves that every fish is different from every other one, to look at the freckles on the noses of various parrotfish, or look at mackerel and say, okay, you see if you can find two that are exactly alike. And you can't. It just doesn't, it's not possible. Find two black cats that are exactly alike. They kind of look alike in the first glance, but if a fish came swimming through this auditorium, they'd probably think that we all look alike too. But it's just a matter of really looking. No two big old speckled rays with the same arrangement of blue spots. or the faces of any particular little angelfish, or rays, or eels, or whatever. And yet, when we see them cooked on a plate, they do pretty much look all alike, whether it's with garlic and lemon or whatever, however you want to prepare them. The time really has arrived when we have to think like a fish, think like an ocean, think like a planet, think as if it matters to take care of the natural systems that take care of us. We no longer can take them for granted. It was that way not so many years ago. That's before there were 6.5 billion of us sneaking up on 7 billion, before we had technologies that, as the fishing industries like to say, fish have no place to hide anymore. We can find them anywhere. You can get fish finders that can make it possible for you, anybody, to go out and spot where they are lurking, where once they could hide. New technologies to relocate places. Exactly. When I started exploring the ocean in the 50s and 60s, getting back to the same exact place in the ocean was a really big deal. It was. You couldn't put an X on the water and hope it would stay there for the next day when you went back. And some of my pals, my graduate student allies at Duke, used to just laugh at me because they would have a station set up in the Duke forest that they'd go back to day after day, week after week, month after month, and get repeated measurements in the same place, look at the growth on individual trees. I couldn't find the same place to go back and do that sort of thing in areas that I couldn't mark in some permanent fashion. But now we can do it. GPS, whatever. There's no excuse for not knowing where on the planet you are, even deep in the sea. And so, for fishermen, it's a great boon. For fish, it's a death sentence, because we now have the capacity to find and catch, if we wanted to, and some people do want to, every last bluefin tuna, or every last of whatever else is out there. We can anticipate where they are and then find the tricky ways and means to go get them. So it's one of the reasons that sharks are in trouble. We haven't gotten that sophisticated with respect to how do you deploy long lines with baited hooks every few feet, think the perfect storm, with the sword fishermen out there spinning hook after hook after hook, baited with mackerel or squid or whatever it is. You don't know who's going to come and grab the hook. There's no sign that says only swordfish need apply. Sharks don't bite or whatever. But the deliberate taking of sharks and other creatures and the bycatch that goes along with it is really taking a huge bite out of the ocean, out of our life support system, if you think of it that way. Trawls that gather shrimp and other bottom dwellers, draggers. If you didn't see it, and people now can see it, I have seen it, you wouldn't be quite so worried. But even if you see what comes up on the deck, I don't know why fishermen are more concerned about the havoc that they're wrecking on the bottom of the ocean, because they can see what comes up in their nets that isn't kept, that gets shoveled over the side because it is not good for market for one reason or another. It's too small, it's too big, it's this species or that. With shrimp, some say that the throwaway to keeper ratio is about 4 to 1, but I haven't seen anything like that. I've seen more like 50 or 100 pounds to 1 pound that gets ditched versus what gets saved. It's hard to find a place where shrimp are so abundant that they're the dominant creature that you catch in the net. You catch everything. It's really like using a bulldozer to catch songbirds. You throw away the forest and you keep a few pounds of protein. In the case of the new deep sea trawls, such as those that catch orange roughy in New Zealand and elsewhere, the catch often brings up corals that are thousands of years old. It's the habitat for orange roughy. And the rule of thumb is you use your oldest nets first to knock down the old coral so you can get to the fish. And you can get to the fish, especially when they're spawning and they aggregate in large numbers like this. There is bycatch here, including the corals, of course, but it seems like just the wrong thing to do, to catch fish, kill fish when they're doing what it takes to make more fish. The breeding aggregations would seem to be the first place you'd want to save and protect, as if your life or your livelihoods at least depend upon it, because they do. Certainly the fish's lives depend on it. We've lost grouper and snapper and other key species in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico because of the irresistible attraction to go to where the fish are spawning and they all gather together in one swoop of the net. You can actually get so much more than you can with the more, the longer, more labor-intensive way of catching them when they have dispersed and gone elsewhere. But it's exactly that kind of action that is costing us the lives of fish and the livelihoods of fishermen. We learned a great deal about the limits of what we can extract from the sea with whales. We didn't learn it well enough, I guess, we humans, because 3 countries at least, Iceland, Norway, Japan, are still taking whales in numbers that are said to be for scientific whaling, or they're said to be for an exception to the International Whaling Commission rules that individual countries can just declare because they choose to declare it so. Iceland does that. And they still take minke whales, and they take other kinds as well. Most people have given up the idea of taking whales, and especially now that we've moved from whale oil to power our lights and heat our homes, and moved on to petroleum. Imagine trying to go to the moon on whale oil as a source of fuel. It wouldn't have happened. We right now can look with horror on what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico or Exxon Valdez or the Persian Gulf, but the flip side of that is that petroleum products have powered our civilization to heights impossible before we turned to that source of fuel, burning forests from 300 million years ago to power our lives in about a century. So what I think we should be facing up to now as we look at what's happening to whales, we've taken the pressure off, generally speaking. Some of them are coming back, generally speaking. Still an ethic that hasn't pervaded the whole world, just most of it, concerning valuing them more alive than dead. But at the same time that we're beginning to think, well, we have to get to other forms of power. We have to think of wind. We have to think and must turn to the sun, the ultimate source of power anyway, to drive our future civilizations. But we still are so casual about the use of the energy that we acquire. It takes a lot of petroleum products to make all that pile of plastic that you see in this image, and think of all the plastic now that clogs the world. It's the one-time use of plastic. It isn't plastic, it's our attitude. It's our casual complacency with the thought that we live in a never-run-out world that will keep on doing its thing no matter what we do to it, whatever we take out or whatever we put into the sea. But our capacity to destroy is so enormous. We have to see a rising time of our capacity to protect and reverse the trends that have happened in my lifetime, in the lifetime of everyone in this room. This is just one of a zillion examples that you could show to horror stories of what happens to the plastic that we casually throw away, the bits and pieces that really don't easily go away in a week or a year or 10 years or a century. They just last and last. One of the great things about plastic is they are objects, they're durable, and they're light, and they're inexpensive the way we measure costs these days. But when swallowed by young birds, parents see these colorful objects floating in the ocean, gobble them up, take them to their youngsters. This little bird, this albatross, never got to fly, nor do hundreds of thousands of others who are similarly stuffed with our debris. And it isn't just things like that. It's discarded fishing gear that goes on fishing. This is a problem that I've known about for decades, and yet we're still doing it. Ghost nets. When I was here in the 60s, talk about what a sad thing it was that that there was so much of this derelict gear out in the ocean. Well, that was decades ago. There's much more of it today. One of the big hazards of using a little submarine is fear of somehow getting tangled up in a fishing net. Well, it's not as bad for a little submarine because we can call a rescue submarine to come and help bail us out, but no such luck for these sea lions. Or literally hundreds of thousands of other marine mammals. The estimate is 300,000 marine mammals die every year, caught entangled incidentally, either in derelict gear or in gear that is actively in use, and also thousands and thousands of birds and turtles. This little turtle, this is a good news story because he was still alive, and we were able in the Galapagos Islands to snip away that little fishing float, and we hope he's still out there prospering. And this is another good news story. Volunteers going out to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands helping NOAA during the summer to retrieve derelict gear and to try to dispose of it properly. Some of it, I am told, goes into making polar fleece jackets. Yes, why not? We now know. We know so much that we couldn't know half a century ago, which makes it really exciting for those of us on the planet right now, because never before have we had that breakthrough of understanding that we can hold the world in our hands in a way that we couldn't do when I was a kid. You could see a globe and spin it around and see that there were big patches of blue and brown and green and so on, but now you can see real images of Earth from space. You can actually make the connections between one part of the planet and the other, that the sands from Africa come across and actually wind up right here in Boston, and some continue out and dust the snows of Colorado, and some keep sweeping around the planet and maybe wind up back in the Sahara Desert again. The currents of the sky. We see the same kinds of things in the ocean, things that get swept around from one part of the planet to another. Now we can see what we couldn't see half a century ago, big patterns, because scientists began to measure and go back and measure again and go back and measure again, so that trends are now apparent that our predecessors could not have perceived. You could guess, you could imagine, but now we know that things are happening, that we are causing, the cause and effect relationship between what we do on one kind of activity and the consequences back to the present and the future. In this case, the trend in the loss of ice with the increase in temperature, the increase in carbon dioxide that not only is affecting the atmosphere above, but the terrible twin of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above, the ocean below, with acidification, the new big worry on the horizon, changing the chemistry of the ocean through a trend towards acidification. This is the time as never before when we are armed with knowledge that we couldn't have, didn't have. What more will we have in another 10 years? Well, it's going to get better in terms of our knowledge base, but what won't get better is the state of the environment if we don't take some actions now. We know enough to know we're in trouble, and we have time because we haven't lost all the sharks yet. Half the coral reefs are still in pretty good shape. They have declined by half. Some are gone entirely. Some are in terrible shape, but the good news is there's some still around. We haven't yet lost a chance. We did lose a chance with monk seals in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. They're all gone as of 1952, when I was a child. But we still have other creatures that aren't all gone. But what will future generations say to us if they ask, you were there when there were polar bears, why didn't you do something? Well, there was still a chance. There is still a chance. But we can't just sit around wringing our hands and moaning or denying that it's happening at all. There are things that we can do to protect the fabric of life on Earth that gives us resilience, the ability to rebound from the changes that are taking place, some of natural cause, much that we are driving ourselves. I'm very aware of what's happening as a result of the excess CO2 because I have a home in Florida. It was my mother and dad's place down on the West Coast. near Clearwater. They moved there from New Jersey, and at a time when Clearwater had clear water. It doesn't now, but that's not the biggest problem. Biggest problem is this inexorable creep of ocean taking over Florida. Think of all the condominiums on West Palm Beach that will be there for fish in the not too distant future. And Miami Beach, oh, wow. The lobsters are going to have lots of havens. Maybe there are things that we can do. I mean, there are things we can do. We just have to take it seriously instead of brushing it off as somebody else's problem, the kid's problem coming along, or somewhere out there, maybe 1,000 years from now. Well, we've had the wake-up call that what we're doing to life in the sea, life on the land, affects our lives too. These little fellows, coccolithophorids, calcium carbonate shell, susceptible to a change in acidification of the ocean. Is it clearly apparent yet? Are we seeing a bubbling of coral reefs as they dissolve into the sea? No, but the experiments that are now being done by scientists suggest that it won't take much to really cause a change in the plankton, those that have the calcium carbonate shell, snails, the planktonic pteropods, and many other creatures that are susceptible to an acidic environment, more acidic at least than what we now have. Coral reefs, we take them more or less for granted. This is what you kind of expect a coral reef looks like as you fly a nice, healthy place. Some of them still exist that look like this. Out in the Line Islands, a place recently established for protection. In the Indian Ocean, where the United Kingdom just a few weeks ago established what is now the largest area in the sea where even the fish are safe. It's something on the order of 544,000 square kilometers where even the fish have sanctity, have a safe haven. And with the fish, of course, everything else. But the principal problem driving the destruction of those waters was aggressive fishing. It's happening around the world. It's not just this country, of course, it's global. And the warming trend that causes the zooxanthellae, the little microorganisms that live in the tissues of corals, to escape, leaving not dead coral, but weakened coral. Then sometimes they prosper and come back for another season or two. Sometimes they simply die. Whole stretches of ocean have been destroyed as a consequence of this, coupled with the other stresses that we're putting on the sea, the removal of ocean wildlife, parts of a coral reef. It's not just about the coral. It's about the fish, the parrotfish, the surgeonfish, the grouper, the snapper, all pieces of what it takes to make a thriving coral reef. Too often, this is what you see in places that even 20 years ago were prosperous reefs. The good news is, with protection, and sometimes it's as simple as don't kill the fish anymore, even in areas that look as though they're not going to recover, begin to prosper again. It's recovery of the fish. When you stop killing the fish, guess what? They begin to rebound, if there are some to start with. And the system begins to rebound as well. There are experiments that are now taking place around the world to demonstrate that we can take positive action. And you hear it often, and I'll say it again. We can go to the moon, leave footprints there. Why can't we, whatever it is, take the actions, use our technologies, harness our good minds, be inspired by what we know now to be true, and move our decisions in the direction of caring for the world that takes care of us. I think about it a lot. I have 3 kids. I have 4 grandsons. And I do worry about our place in history from their standpoint, or those who are beyond them. We're just leaving them crumbs of systems that were degraded to a great extent when all of us arrived. But we've been doing a very good job of chewing through the assets, using up the World Bank. It's time to turn around. Wake up now that we can. We have the means of communicating as we never had before. And one of the means of communication that I particularly love is, let's see if I have it here. That's not Google Earth, but it is the Earth. 4 years ago, I attended a conference in Spain, and John Hankey, who was the big boss at Google Earth, a small part of Google, was in the audience. We were both giving talks. I got to go first. I saw him sitting in the front. And it just occurred to me as I looked at this smiling character listening to me talk about the ocean, how much I really love Google Earth. You know, you can download it onto your laptop or your desktop, and you can fly down from the sky and into your backyard, and you can see your neighbor's backyard, and you can go to Starbucks and you can find the Grand Canyon and swoop down the Grand Canyon. And I said this, and I said, I love it. My grandkids love it. And then I just said, but John, I hope someday you will finish it, because the ocean is a big blob of blue. You just have the surface. And it just popped into my head. I didn't mean to say it, but I said it anyway. I said, you should call it Google Dirt, because you've done a great job with the land, but what about the ocean? What about the blue part? Oh, he could have gotten in a huff and not spoken to me thereafter, but he didn't, because I did this publicly, big audience like this. He said, well, you know, you're right. There is something missing. You should come down to the Googleplex and talk to the Googlers and tell us what we need to do. And so I did. And they asked, well, what do we need to do to make the world whole? And I said, well, you need to talk to the Navy, because they have maps, the seafloor bathymetry. And I said, but my brain isn't big enough to really tell you. We need to get some experts in here. And so they did. They got about 30 people to come and advise. And a year ago, launched the ocean in Google Earth. And I was just so pleased. I am pleased. Now it's free. It used to be $600 to download Google Earth. But now anybody can do it. Any kid can dive with the whales. And the last little bit I want to close with here are a couple of video clips that you can find on Google Earth, cooperation with the National Geographic. They've populated a lot of places, and you can populate Google Ocean too with your own images. It's a platform. It's a platform that you can go play on and find stories about what's going on in the ocean. It's really just beginning. I can't wait to see what's going to happen in the next few years as people embrace this technology and make it their own and populate the land and the sea with information, knowledge that will help us get from where we are to where we need to be in terms of protecting the planet that keeps us alive. Now, I, as you know, am really moving flat out to try to inspire protected areas in the ocean. I call them hope spots. So here's the thing. I mean, I can look back on our predecessors and say, why did you kill the last monk seal? You, whoever you were. Or what about the stellar sea cow? They were discovered and gone within a few decades, exterminated. I can almost forgive them. Or the great auk, for heaven's sakes, in the North Atlantic. Because they didn't know. They really didn't understand the connection between the wild world and us. There's no excuse anymore for that. We know now that our lives are closely coupled to the rest of life on Earth. The information is there. It's definable, measurable, and yet it's not widely communicated. People have to know before they can care, and even if they do know, they don't always care. But you can't care if you don't know. And one reason I'm so pleased to be here with you in this institution, it's all about knowing, about communicating what knowledge has been gathered over the years and just disseminating that information so that not just the kids coming along, but much of what we now know has just been recently discovered. It's been discovered in our lifetime. And it's hard to get your minds around all of this great mishmash of new information. And it takes institutions such as this to distill it out and communicate it in ways that people can understand. So I really want to close by saluting you for what you're doing to support this place, and thank you for having me here. and to dream, perhaps, with me about coming back in 50 years and see how it all comes out. Because what we do right now for the next 10 years or so probably does have just a magnified impact, certainly, but maybe the most important piece of time in all of history, because for the first time we know things that we couldn't know even half a century ago, and if we wait another half century, it'll be too late to save many things that are on the edge, including us, if we really think about it. How much more of the planet's asset base can we chew our ways through before we get to the point where it cannot sustain us anymore? We're not there yet, but we can see that we could get there if we keep doing what we're doing. We could lose the opportunity to continue commercial fishing if we continue what we're doing now. Having lost 90%, we're down to 10% of many kinds. It won't take 50 years to do them in and do the fishermen in along with the fish. Go figure. We need to wake up, use this knowledge, take action. No matter who you are, what you have power. The real trick is using it. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. There'll be microphones floating around. If you want to just put your hand up, one of the folks with the mics will come to you.
Thank you. Actually, as of this morning, I officially became a new science teacher.
Yes.
And I have taught months of astronomy, and I've taught one lesson on bioluminescence. And it catches the kids so much more. And I want to know, why is it that NASA has so much power of getting the lion's share of the money from the government? How can we turn the tide, as it were, to change things?
I personally wouldn't take a penny away from our investment in the skies above. I just want an equal amount of pennies, at least, going in the other direction, and to do so as if our lives depend on it, because they do. They do. They really, really do. And it really takes actions from people such as we are to make that happen, to let our voices be heard, not just to ask for it, but to demand that we really invest in ocean exploration and ocean care as well, and, well, for the land as well. We need better, bigger national parks and better policies about protecting the assets, the natural, and in the process we'll save our own historic and cultural values too. But it starts with protecting the natural systems. Every tree counts, every fish counts, every coral counts. And we need to think of it in those terms. We think right now about how every human being counts. And if we really believe that, we'll make the connection back to all the rest. I'm really concerned about the loss of so much that I've seen in my lifetime, the lifetime even of 10-year-olds. It's just, it makes your heart stop with concern. Ed Wilson talks about how we're letting nature slip through our fingers. He said so last year on his 80th birthday party that was being held in New York. But the bigger concern is we are so undermining the integrity of the systems that keep us alive that nature may let us slip through her fingers. That's the concern.
Hi, what is your assessment of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico? Can you just say a few words about that?
My assessment is it's bad news. Oh my gosh. Huh. And well, part of the angst, the agony over that is that it should have been preventable, in that the blowout preventers that are now standard for every drilling operation in this country, around the world, it's technology that has developed over the last several decades that is there as a backstop, as a safety measure, if something like this should happen. A blowout preventer is supposed to prevent blowouts. Normally they do. There has been such a good track record of safety with respect to most drilling operations that a kind of complacency has set in, and most attention has been focused on the shipping of oil, like the Exxon Valdez and other major spills. Pipelines break, ships crash on rocks, or they do stupid things with ships that cause the hulls to break, whatever it is. But here is just a wake-up call, the big 2x4, that there are hazards associated with drilling that we really do have to put on the balance sheet. There may be one positive aspect of this event to really shake us down to the tips of our flippers in terms of understanding that, you know, there are risks to be taken if we are to go drilling, not just in shallow water, but off into deep water. And the deeper we go, the more difficult it gets. On the balance sheet should have been, you can easily say in retrospect, calculations about, okay, this is 5,000 feet of water, a mile underwater. What backup systems do we have should something go wrong? This is not the first deep water drilling operation. There are others out there. Shell oil has, I think, a system that's close to 10,000 feet. And so far, no big problems. I mean, there is no clean drilling operation. When a drilling hole goes down into the ground in the ocean, you bring up, I mean, it's not just down to the surface of the bottom, it goes down thousands of feet, and when they bring up that which they drill out, it goes out on the surrounding seafloor, along with drilling muds. Some of them are toxic. So there's a footprint around a drilling rig that is affected by the drilling operation, but people don't see it because it's down there. What they worry about is the oil if it leaks and you get a spill. That's the big worry that most people have had. It troubles me that most of the attention seems to be focused on when the oil comes ashore, as if that's when the problem begins. No, you have to think like an ocean, think like a fish, think like the plankton. The problem begins when oil gushes up from the depths and into the water column and on the ocean surface. And finally it does get to shore, and yes, it's a problem, but it's a problem from the very beginning. And there are natural seeps in the Gulf of Mexico and around in various other oil-rich areas, such as off Santa Barbara, natural seeps. And the local fish and other organisms accommodate it. I mean, they grow up with it, but not growing up with 5,000 barrels a day gushing out into the ocean. That's a different scene altogether. Even if you're oil-adapted creatures and you like a little bit of oil, you might like a little bit of chocolate too, but if you have 5,000 barrels a day, it could kind of not be good news. And worse news, or at least as bad, is, I mean, it's not as bad, but another problem is using dispersants that do not make the oil go away. They disperse. That's what they are called. They break it up into little pieces, and it's more toxin in the water, not just the oil, but the toxins from, I mean, it's a detergent kind of action. Breaks it up, makes it less visible. And that's not solving the problem. You're just spreading it around and causing, in some cases, for the oil and the dispersants to sink into the water column and be part of this most critical area, the upper part of the ocean, where most of the little larval stages of fish and other creatures tend to be up in that upper area, because that's where much of the food is. Little larval fish, the spawning is really active this time of the year, not just the fish, but the shrimp are spawning now. So many of these little eggs that tend to float, and larval stages that tend to be up in that upper 100 meters or the upper 10 feet even, is a very active zone that is the most affected by the toxins that are there. Imagine being a dolphin and you're out there rising up in the middle of where there's a spill. The most concentrated toxic stuff is right there at the air-sea interface, which is where oxygen gets generated. It's where carbon dioxide is taken into the sea, and we've just laced it with this toxic lake on top of the ocean. So what do I think about it? I think that I'm thinking about it. And when I get to go next week to talk about it with BP executives addressing Congress, I will try to formulate more carefully what I think could be done going forward and what's happening right now to the creatures in the ocean, where most of the attention is not focused there. It's focused on the beach, where people have real estate and they value their places to put, you know, chairs and things. But the ocean is where the troubles really are. We need to really focus on that. Yes. Oh, sorry, you tell me.
A couple of thousand years ago, there was considerable pressure on wildlife from hunter-gatherers. That pressure was relieved by agriculture, and agriculture kind of saved the day, allowed us to populate to the levels that we are populated now. The same process is slowly being enacted in the marine environment. We now see a considerable percentage of the available seafood in our daily diet is actually the result of aquaculture, tilapia being the most prevalent, salmon as well. Taking the optimistic view that the rate at which we develop aquaculture will allow us to emerge from hunter-gatherer to farmer of the sea. I guess it's an unfair question, but what percentage of the sea, or what percentage of the actual resources of the sea would actually be necessary to meet our current demand for seafood, and thereby eliminating the actual hunting that's going on right now? I have an optimistic view of this, and perhaps it's unrealistic, but it seems to be that it worked once, maybe it can work twice.
I tend to be an optimist as well. Also, I'd like to think in terms of what gives real cause for hope and what gives cause for despair. I think farming salmon is wrong-headed for a fundamental reason. They're carnivores, and they're further up a food chain than lions and tigers. They eat fish that eat fish that eat fish that eat other fish, and finally they get down to the crustaceans and then ultimately to the little photosynthetic microorganisms that drive much of the way the world works. But in the same way that it doesn't make sense to, quotes, farm tuna. At least with salmon, they've kind of closed the loop, raising salmon from salmon that have been raised. Not true with tuna. It's really tricky to raise a tuna from scratch, from taking eggs and making a big full-grown tuna, and it takes time. Think of all the things that agriculture has brought us, aside from corn, rice, and wheat that provide half the calories that feed people around the world, and the 100 or so other plants that are the basic staples that keep most of us alive in terms of calories. The protein that we raise, we're not raising lions, let alone snow leopards. What we're raising are fast-growing herbivores. The sooner we get them to the market, the better it is from a financial, commercial, economic standpoint. Sunlight plants cow, sunlight plants chicken, sunlight plants turkey, sunlight plants whatever, the things that we raise. Either you stop with the plants or you go one step beyond to the grazers. Perversely, we're going out to the ocean, catching millions of tons of little fish, grinding them up into fish meal and feeding them to cows and chickens and pigs. We should just say, no, don't do this. This is killing the ocean, and it also doesn't taste very good. You get fishy tasting chickens. And it's like, and you get your daily dose of mercury and things like that that you really don't want. I don't know whether any of you saw the Colbert Show. I was roasted on the Colbert Show last October. And we started talking about what you could perhaps choose to eat that would be a better deal for the ocean. And I suggested catfish, carp, tilapia, farm-raised, closed systems, ideally, so you get more crop per drop, as they say. And they're all grazers. So from egg to adult in less than a year, with about 2 pounds of plants for a pound of protein, you can get tilapia, catfish, or carp. To get a nice fish-fed, food chain-fed tuna fish out of the ocean, think in terms of maybe 100,000 pounds of little green things down at the bottom of the food chain that it takes to make this big, long tail of investment into 1 pound of tuna, or shark, or swordfish, or these other top carnivores. It may not be 100,000, maybe it's only 50,000 pounds, but it's a lot more than 2, or 20 for a cow, or a pig, or a sheep. It takes more for the bigger warm-blooded animals than for the cold-blooded fish that grow very fast and eat plants. But whatever, there are some answers, there are some solutions. Part of the problem with salmon is the wild fish, that they catch this many wild fish to get this many farm fish. And when you think about the fish, they're not at the bottom of the food chain either. It's taken that many fish to make the fish that go to make the salmon. And there are all the other problems that people worry about, such as the use of antibiotics, the genetic confusion that is caused when Atlantic salmon grown in the Pacific escape and get into the system. And it's really time to rethink and carefully think about open ocean aquaculture. It's not don't do it, but be really careful about the investments that are made and where they're done and what kinds of fish are raised. There's some really good choices, but there aren't many that we have winnowed down all of the mammals and birds in the world to a handful that really work. And it's probably true in the ocean, a handful that can really do the job to feed a lot of high-quality protein to a great many people at a minimum cost. But it's not salmon, it's not swordfish, it's not tuna, and it's not halibut. They're all big carnivores that eat other fish, and so on. For a luxury meal once in a while, if you want to go out to the Copper River and stand next to the eagles and the bears and catch dinner, go for it. But you know, the farm-raised solution there is probably misguided. Catfish, again, I think it doesn't make sense to import them from Taiwan when you can do locally raised with a small carbon footprint to have them in your backyard. Some people, I understand, are raising tilapia in their New York apartments. The only problem is they get attached to the fish. What can you say? I mentioned to Colbert that if people knew what orange roughy were called by scientists, people probably wouldn't eat them. They're known as slime heads. And you probably know that Chilean sea bass that take 30 years to mature and live a long time and come from deep water and huge destruction in catching them, that they're known as Patagonian toothfish. And if you saw that on a menu, maybe you wouldn't be so inclined to order it as well. But gosh, Chilean sea bass sounds really cool. So Colbert said first, well, if I can't eat wild fish, how am I going to get my mercury then? And then about the naming of things, he came back with, well, so if we started calling earthworms Appalachian yard trout, maybe people would go for earthworms. Whatever it takes.
So this will be our very last question.
So you have sort of commented on a lot of this already, but I was hoping you could address, for those of us with the luxury of making sort of ethical consumer food choices, the debate between the supposedly sustainable seafood versus just not eating seafood at all. Where do you think is the best way to put your money?
Well, you know, I just say no. I do, because I have come personally to value every fish alive more than every fish that I see dead. I think that we're so important right now to protect them, give them a chance to rebound. There's so many things that we can eat. Maybe once in a while I have a good friend who's a chef, Barton Seaver, who used to be with a restaurant called Hooked in Washington. He's left them and on to other things, but his answer is eat broccoli. But no, he also says that he realizes, as do I, that people really do love seafood, but do you have to have all the shrimp you can eat every day of the week? Can't you make it a special treat every once in a while? He says that with tuna, if you just have to have your tuna every once in a while, get out the candles, polish the silver, get out the crystal, put on a nice embroidered tablecloth, and make it a very special occasion, and eat every bite with great respect. But don't just take it as if it's an ordinary thing. It shouldn't be regarded as ordinary. If you've ever seen any of the tunas, particularly the bluefins, out in the ocean, the last thing you'd probably ever want to do with them is to eat them. Even if you've had sushi and sashimi and all the rest before and know how good they taste. I mean, if you were served Labrador Retriever, you might enjoy it until you know what they really are. But ask MIT engineers who developed Robo Tuna, trying to emulate what tunas do naturally, capturing the efficiency of the power when they swish their tail back and forth and power their way through the ocean. On the order of 97% of the energy generated is captured. The little whirlpools, little vortices that are generated when they swish the tail back and forth, and it pushes them through. I mean, they're considered to be maybe the fastest fish in the sea. Outstrip a nuclear submarine, 50 miles an hour, in the water, for heaven's sakes. They're so sleek. Their dorsal fin snaps down into a pocket. Even their pectoral fins fit into little hollowed out places on their hides so that they are just as sleek as they can be as they power through the water. And they tried, those engineers at MIT, to equal what a tuna does naturally. They haven't quite succeeded in capturing that with that efficiency, but they've learned a great deal. And suppose we eat the last one before learning what we really need to know about them and, everything else that's out there. There's so much that, many of the world's problems with human societies or with our relationship with the natural world could be made a whole lot better. I'm not saying that they would be fixed, but made a whole lot better if we treat every living thing with dignity and respect, even a form of reverence. Because we don't know how to make living things. We certainly know how to destroy them. But we don't photosynthesize. We have to eat something. But do so with respect and understand what the consequences are. What's good for you, what's good for the world. It's a way you can make a difference. Thank you.